Welcome. In this video lecture we're going to review graphs. Graphs are very important in this course, so I want to take this opportunity to make sure everyone's on the same page in terms of using and interpreting graphs. So first we're going to go through the types of graphs, the different types, which we've all seen before, but I'm using this opportunity to really highlight which graph we're particularly interested in this course. And then we'll get into how we're going to use them in this course, and then and in doing so we'll give some preliminary insights on some parts of the upcoming course. So the types of graphs. The first one we're going to review is the pie chart, and we've seen this before obviously, but the issue that I want to point out is that the pie chart generally focuses on one variable, and in particular it illustrates the proportion of categories of that variable. Second type is a bar chart, and again we've seen this before, but the issue I want to point out is that generally it's also used for one variable at a time. And then we have a time series plot. And what this does is it tracks one variable over time. So it measures one variable and how that variable changes over time, and it's useful to illustrate a trend of a variable over time. In this example here, we can see how GDP per worker has changed over the years. Then we have the scatter plot. And the scatter plot is unique because it illustrates two variables, and in particular it illustrates the relationship between two variables. So for example, suppose that you went out and asked 100 people what their height and their weight is, and you recorded this down onto in your notebook. All right, and then you went back and you plotted that data out onto a diagram, a 2x2 diagram as you see here. What this would reveal is the relationship between weight and height. All right, so each one of those circles in the diagram would illustrate an individual. So this individual here would be someone that responded to those two questions with 50 as their weight and their 140 as their height. Right, and then you have all the other individuals that responded. And what that line represents is, using statistics, you can estimate the relationship between height and weight. This gives you a precise statistical estimation of how weight and height are related to one another. So that's what the scatter plot is able to illustrate: two variables, and more specifically the relationship between those two variables. So economics and graphs. In economics, we're interested in relationships. Right? We're interested in the cause and effect relationships. How does X affect Y? We're not interested in just one variable at a time. We're interested in relationships. So for example, we would like to know what happens to income when education increases. This gets at one of the fundamental questions of economics: is what determines standards of living? Why do some people or countries do better than other countries? So we want to know what explains income levels or standards of living. And we can do this by analyzing the relationships between income and various other variables. Right, so we're going to rely on the scatter plot. So within this course, we're going to see the demand curve, which is a scatter plot. It shows the relationship between price and quantity demanded. Right, so a scatter plot shows the relationship between two variables. This is just a particular type of scatter plot that shows the relationship between price and quantity demanded. Right, so price is one variable, that's the price of the good. Quantity demanded is the level of purchases, or the number of units that consumers want to purchase at a given price. Now the demand curve is going to hold all the other things constant, which we'll talk about in just one second. But what we usually see is that there's a negative relationship between price and quantity demanded. If price increases, the number of units that consumers want to purchase will fall. And if price decreases, the number of units that consumers want to buy will go up. Right? So this is what we consider the law of demand. So let's get back to this issue of holding other things constant, which we'll talk about a couple more times in this course. Given that this diagram is a two-dimensional diagram, it only illustrates the relationship between two variables, no more, just two. But more than two matter, right? So what that diagram illustrates is limited to just those two variables. It's the relationship between those two variables. Everything else is held constant. Nothing else changes along that line. So for example, suppose that income is determined by two factors, experience and education. Now there might be other variables that matter, but just for simplicity we're just going to look at these two factors. So we have a diagram here, a scatter plot, a line that was estimated from a bunch of observations and data that was collected. So we have this line that illustrates the relationship between income and education. And as we see, this upward sloping, so it's a positive relationship as we might expect, right? Greater education leads to greater income. But along one line, suppose that you have experience is equal to 5 years. Right? So we're at the lower line there. Right? Along that line, experience is held constant at 5. If experience changed, then we would have to draw a new line because that would affect income level. So a line on this two-dimensional graph illustrates the relationship between income and education. It does not illustrate the relationship between experience and income and education. So if experience changes, then we have to draw a new line. Experience goes up to 10 years, that relationship is going to shift upward. Alright, so another issue is slope and elasticity. Slope indicates the responsiveness of the relationship. Alright, so before we talked about a positive and negative relationship, meaning that if one goes up, the other one goes up or down. What slope allows you to do is be more precise. So you can actually say, well, what if x goes up by a certain amount? Then you can say that y will change by a specific amount. So it gives you more precision in the interpretation. Right? And you can see that this could be important because what if someone tells you that going to college will increase your income? That's some information, but it would be more helpful if they told you that if you got a college degree, you can expect to increase your income by 20%. Now slope, which we've seen before, is the nominal change. Elasticity is similar, and all it does is it puts it in relative terms, in percentage terms. So let's do a quick example here. Right? So we'll go back to the demand curve where your two variables are price and quantity demanded. So in one case, you might think that a price change has a relatively small impact on quantity demand. Right? You can think of some goods and services that have this quality. And those are the goods and services that you'll buy, you're more likely to buy regardless if the price goes up or not. Right? So those are gas, cigarettes, milks, the things that are more necessary. Right? So that demand curve is going to be relatively steep because you can see that for a given price change, you're going to have a relatively small change in quantity. So here's the alternative example. Or let's say that price change has a relatively large impact on quantity demanded. Now these might be luxury items that we don't really need, and if the price went up a significant amount, then we might not even purchase it anymore. There are other alternatives that we might choose to purchase. And in this case, you can see that the demand curve is going to be relatively flat. And you can imagine that if a price changes in this with the flat demand curve, you're going to have a relatively large change in quantity demanded. The steepness of the demand curve tells us how responsive buyers are to price changes. And that can be something very important to businesses and entrepreneurs. So a small price change can lead to a big change in demand if the demand curve is relatively flat, or you could change prices and have a small change in quantity demand. That's the end of this review of graphs. Don't forget to review your notes, and of course you could revisit this lecture or any parts of it if you have questions, and feel free to send me emails with your questions.